Well, hey, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute after the show today.
Yeah, no problem at all, Joe. And it's a pleasure to be on and to meet you.
Absolutely. So before we get into your good work, I want to know this. 5 years ago, this pandemic changed our lives, changed the world. How did you get through that era, and how has it influenced the way that you approach life and work today?
That's a very good question, Joe. Like a lot of us, it meant a retreat into your own space. Fortunately, the property that I'm in and that we're in as a family is in the countryside in Scotland, in central Scotland, and we actually own a field. So we have an acre of land as well. So it meant that our pandemic was not half as bad as say somebody stuck in an apartment block in a big city. But the issue really was that retreat into yourself, but also actually it did have a profound effect on some of the choices that I've subsequently made. Because after 30 years of being what I would call at the institutional front line, where I was sort of riding the rapids, I was doing everything at my university. I was doing research, but I was also doing teaching and administration. And a year or two ago, I decided to step back from that after 30 years in order to sort of quote unquote do more interesting things. Sort of, do things like, for example, podcasts, maybe develop more of a media presence. Also, as well, write more because although as an academic, one of our primary goals is to actually write and research. Often in institutional academic life, that can be heavily squeezed because of other demands. So, although the pandemic, I would say, is not the sole cause of some of the decisions I've made recently, it was certainly a contributory factor. And I think it has been for a lot of people. It kind of allowed people to sort of get what their priorities should be in life. Should it be, all work? Or should it be more of a balance? So yeah, that's a very good question.
So let's get into the marrow and the heart and soul of not only what you do today, but what your career focus has been. And I'm going to put you in a schoolhouse. It's career day. They're 12-year-old kids, a whole field of those faces looking at you. And one of the kids in the back of the room says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" What's your answer?
Yeah. Well, I have to admit, at 12 years old, I'm not sure I had much of a clue. But what I had done throughout my life was engage with the media. And particularly, I grew up, I mean, I don't know what age you are, but I grew up in the 1970s. And I think looking back historically, as I now do, because I can range back 100, 120 years of media history, I think the 1970s was an absolute high peak for the medium of television. And that in many ways, what we've seen in the last 30 years is the decline of television as a medium with the rise of the internet. So I grew up watching the tube, as you call it in the States, and I was part of that generation. And I still joke about this today. I remember my mother sort of telling me, "You're watching too much television. You'll never make anything of yourself watching television." But in the end, I sort of turned that fascination for the box in the corner to an academic career, and I started at a time when certainly in the UK and in Europe, that wasn't such a big career path. It's only really in the last 30 years or so that universities, certainly in Europe, have begun to develop the notion of courses specifically about the media and about understanding it. Before it used to be regarded as sub-intellectual, why would you look at the media? And I think in the States as well, while there are media programs, a lot of them were very practically focused about teaching people the how-tos, how to press that button. But actually, to stand back and look conceptually at it, and particularly maybe in the area that I work in, which is looking historically at it, that wasn't so common. So I was part of also of that generation of people saying, well, why can't we look at the media in some depth? Why can't we see the fact that this is such an omnipresent feature of our lives? I mean, the amount of media consumption that we all consume daily is just unbelievable,
Yeah.
particularly now in the advent of social media. So why isn't that being looked at? So that's very much, I was part of that generation, the kind of 70s, 80s generation. So obviously I grew up in the 70s, but went to university in the 1980s, and then started my career in the early 1990s.
It's interesting. I'm 53, so the 80s was kind of my bevy of media consumption. I was on the fuselage of that 70s, but it's interesting how you talk about how that was the time where all of it really came to fruition and it kind of went down from there. And I think about journalism. I got into journalism when I was in college, and my editor, who's one of my favorite people of all time, still a good friend, I asked him, with all of this rampant corruption going on in our American political system right now,
Mm.
something like Watergate just simply isn't happening. The fact that we can't put some level of journalistic dragnet around what anybody that has a pulse can see is completely rampantly illegal. What happened? And he said it's been all of this social media. There's been no like corroborating evidence, like people just put stuff out and believe it. There's this level of AI that's happening. Journalistic integrity has taken a nosedive, along with what you've talked about the media. From your perception, do you see that we've kind of gone through this de evolution of real integrity, 60 Minutes fueled journalism?
Yeah, de definitely when we look at the United States, for sure. In the UK, we still have, in many ways, a bulwark against that, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC.
Yeah,
Now, the BBC has had a lot to deal with in the last few decades, and it is definitely not the organization it once was, but it still has at its heart objectivity and impartiality at its core. Now, when we look at the States, what I see, and often these days for me, being outside of the United States, my consumption of 60 Minutes, for example, tends to be clips on social media. And in many ways, it's still trying to fly the flag of that old school tradition, but you do get the sense that it's maybe slightly crooking at the seams. As I understand, a former editor, for example, resigned fairly recently
yeah,
over corporate control. Now, one of the big things that I think is useful to put the United States picture in perspective is the amount of corporate control that there now is. And that in many ways, from the 1980s onwards, we've seen a massive centralization of ownership and control of the media in the United States. Now, you might think that sounds a bit odd, given that we're now in the era of the internet, where anybody can do anything. As an American scholar, Henry Jenkins, once said, "Here comes everybody," with the advent of social media. But actually, some interesting statistics. In 1983, there was concern that the bulk of the US media was owned by about 40 companies. By the 2010s, that had narrowed down to about six huge mega corporations. The people that own CBS, the people that own Universal, and so on. Now, you might say, well, hang on, we're now in the era of Netflix and Apple TV. But what you've begun to see is the disruption of all the old traditional media models by what you might call, it's a lovely acronym, FANG, the FANG companies. That is, its acronym Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. And there's parent companies like Meta, for example, in the case of Facebook. So what we're seeing is a huge conglomeration of ownership, so that you've got a few rich big tech owners like the infamous Jeff Bezos who owns Amazon, the evolution of these super rich owners of mega corporations, and then you've got the traditional big six, the people that own currently the Hollywood studios and there's only about six of them. So in the United States, you've got huge conglomeration of ownership, and we've seen recently key examples that the whole talk show controversy of talk show hosts being suspended
yeah.
because of large corporations worrying about the Trump era. So that would be my picture to you, sort of a letter from Europe to you guys in the States.
Yeah.
It's about that huge conglomeration of ownership. And while we can all frolic around on the sands of social media, if you like, we have to look at the fact that who's actually controlling that big ocean that lies beyond the sands. It's a few giant mega corporations, whether in big tech, which is now threatening and disrupting the old model, or whether it's the old model subject to the vicissitudes of corporate control.
So when let's go back to that schoolhouse when you were a kid. What was your dream job? Was it always to be a teacher? Was it always to be in the media? How did this happen?
Well, I think probably if I've always been good at writing, and I was always good at stories and being creative, and so I loved engaging with creativity, and that's been a feature of my career, over the last 30, 40 years. I tend to sort of research people who are very, very gifted creators, people like Dennis Potter, Peter Watkins. I don't know if you've heard of these people, but I'm happy to explain for your audience who they are. So I've researched in that area. And also, I was always very good at sort of words. And I majored in English as an English literature and language graduate at a very traditional university called the University of Edinburgh. So going right back to that schoolhouse, I was always good at that. But I always had that media side of me as well. That I didn't want to just study Chaucer or Charles Dickens. I wanted to engage with quote unquote the real world. So when this field of which I was part of began to grow up, this media and communications field, it was an ideal field for me because I could do both. I could indulge my love of writing and of words and creativity, but at the same time also indulge that media interest. So the kid at 12 in the schoolhouse who maybe hadn't a clue what he wanted actually to do, in many ways, I've kind of made my hobby my career. In fact, some of my relatives who are my same generation have maybe gone into jobs such as more conventional jobs like finance and engineering often say, what they like about the fact that what I've done is I pursued my hobby rather than study what I thought would get me the best job at the end of it.
Yeah. So who's been your hero? Who's been your inspirational force for your career and life?
Well, I mean, there are personal inspirations, obviously one's parents, for example, but I mentioned Dennis Potter,
Hmm.
who was kind of foundational for me in establishing, me and what I did. And for those in America who don't know who Dennis Potter was, he was a huge big name in British drama and arts, and particularly television drama in the 1970s, actually from the 1960s through to the 1980s. Um, Listeners and viewers in America may have come across some of the movie versions, Hollywood movie versions of his many television dramas that were made originally for British TV, such as Pennies from Heaven, the MGM musical that was released in 1982, starring Steve Martin, or slightly more recently, the remake of The Singing Detective, which is widely regarded as Dennis Potter's masterpiece, a 1986 production for BBC TV drama that was then remade into Hollywood film in 2003, starring Robert Downey Jr., no less,
Yeah.
as the main character called Philip Marlowe. So Potter was a huge figure and presence in British culture, and to a certain extent, had by the end of his life had started to become known in America. I know people like Martin Scorsese and David Lynch were involved in collaborations with him that actually in the end never came to anything, but they always name checked him as being important. And certainly, I would say the generation of US TV dramatists such as Matthew Viner from the creator of Mad Men has paid homage to him
Yeah.
actually within Mad Men because one of Potter's great devices was characters stepping out of the narrative and bursting into song. And if you remember, I think it's towards the end of the final season of Mad Men. That's exactly what one of the characters does in Mad Men, and other shows as well, such as The Sopranos. They've all sort of paid homage to a lot of Potter's pioneering techniques because what he was a writer who didn't want conventional naturalism in storytelling. He liked to play around with flashbacks and fantasy sequences and surrealism, which is what made him a perfect fit, by the way, with David Lynch. And they were going to work together, but unfortunately, the money couldn't come together for a movie.
Yes.
So, very much, Dennis Potter, if you like, the kind of David Lynch that you guys might know, the British version of David Lynch. So Potter, a huge influence on me. I saw The Singing Detective, the original version, when it aired on BBC TV in 1986, and I was exactly the right age to be influenced by its pyrotechnics and its fantasy storytelling because I was a student by then and studying English literature, and so immersed in that world of creativity. And I could see that what I was watching with The Singing Detective was as good as any work of literature that I was reading for my degree. Flash forward a couple of years, and I'm enrolled in a doctoral program, doing my doctoral thesis on Dennis Potter, and effectively discovering that no one else had done this. Nobody had written books about Dennis Potter or actually studied him. And flash forward a little bit further, and I managed to interview all his colleagues who had worked with him over the years in the realms of producing and directing. And I finally got the summons in 1990, so it shows you how long ago it was, to meet the man himself. And I interviewed Dennis Potter and met him. And this was 4 years before he died, because he died sadly of pancreatic cancer in 1994, but not before giving a famous final television interview that's frequently cited, in which he talked about the famous phrase was seeing the blossom, of seeing, looking at life and realizing that as he faced death, looking at the beauty of life. So I would certainly encourage your viewers and listeners, if they haven't come across Dennis Potter, to look him up.
Yeah.
And he was certainly a huge influence on me because obviously he was foundational to the work that I completed. I completed the PhD and then published it as a book, and in some ways I've been engaged with his work ever since. I'm still writing odd pieces and being involved in various initiatives to do with his work.
So, speaking of your work, what is it that gets you up every day that allows you to do this work at a high level? And being in the media, you got to stay up with things. Things are always changing constantly, almost like technology, Moore's law,
Yeah.
duplicating all the time. What is that motivation? And then you got to take care of your own soul. You got to take care of yourself. What is that collective energy for you every day?
Well, in terms of self-care, that's very important. That's about work-life balance, and we can maybe come back to that. But in a word, I would just say curiosity.
Yeah.
Curiosity is what gets me up in the morning. Finding out, what, even if it is simply as mundane as, what's the latest development in US corporate media that we've discussed, or more interestingly, or perhaps if suddenly a new nugget comes to light, that allows you to reflect back on work that you've previously done. So, for example, with Dennis Potter, I actually have ended up, I was involved as an academic advisor, gaining access to his notebooks and private papers, which are now stored in an archive that I helped his native community, Potter's native community in the west of England. It's a place called the Forest of Dean, very beautiful, remote place. We've set up an archive there where people can go and consult his notebooks. So I've obviously gone through some of those notebooks, and that's fascinating because that's getting direct access to the engine room of that writer's creativity, a man that I'd obviously met.
Yeah.
Uh, and actually seeing how he put the words on paper that became those iconic dramas. And the great thing is, if you discover a nugget that allows you to think, to reassess completely what you had previously known or understood. So that's always fascinating.
So, if you were to have a dream tonight and run into an 18-year-old version of you, or even younger, 16 in that teenage realm, and you had like a coffee table book of your life, of what it's turned out to be, what you've done, and you showed that young version of you what your life is, what you decided to do, would that young version of you believe it?
They might believe it. They might also say, "Oh, that's so old school." And the reason the reason I could say that with some confidence is because I kind of have a teenage version of myself, which is my son, who is 14. and who's also loves the media. I guess it's the environment that he's grown up in. It's the whole nature nurture thing. But he looks at what I've done and says, yeah, but that's so old school, Dad. Today, of course, it's AI, it's social media. And so one is always a product of one's particular time and place. And I like to think that, I have two sides of me. One is the future looking side, because I'm fascinated, I always have been, by the future and new technology. But the other, obviously, looking behind us. And because I think it's very important, often I think a lot of us are dehistoricized. We don't realize the deeper historical trends, and that it's often quite difficult when you're in the flux of the moment to actually see that, in fact, there may be others in the history that have faced, if not identical issues, particularly around technology, but maybe similar sort of types of problem in the past that allows us to see the present more clearly. So that Janus faced, if you like, two faces, one looking to the future, one looking to the past, I think is quite important. But in terms of being a teenager today, I'm kind of living through that vicariously with my own son. And his world is going to be a world that's going to be massively challenged by AI. And the fact that you might no longer need a huge big crew or a Hollywood studio to make a movie. You could do it yourself. Um, it's interesting actually, when I sort of broach those issues maybe with some of his generation, my son's generation, some of his friends as well as my son, there's a lot of fear, I think, amongst Generation Z about AI
Yep.
that because it completely it anchors you away from the real, and what's actually real. So that I think is partly why you often get these kind of, particularly around music, isn't it? The vinyl junkies,
Mhm.
people who sort of, younger generations saying, I don't want the digital age, I want to go back.
Yep.
So maybe we all look back to a certain extent. Maybe it's not just me.
You know, I was a media major in college, and I've always been interested in a lot of the things that you're into. I love David Lynch. There's a lot of things we're kindred spirits on. And I think sometimes about what was the moment, the big moment where things inextricably changed. I think about JFK's assassination. Sometimes I think if Robert Kennedy didn't get assassinated, maybe that would have averted all of this dire political drama we're going through right now in America. But I think more than anything, I'm like, what was that pivotal point? Was it the moon landing? What was it? In your estimation, whether it was a news story or it was an advent of a technology, what do you see as the shapeshifter, the thing that turned us into this technologically driven, this kind of world that we're in right now? The brave new world that we never thought Aldous Huxley was professing that would happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, because having that longer historical perspective is quite important, because a lot of people might say, oh, well, it's when the internet came along, and I remember, probably you do as well, a world before the internet. And I remember it was 1994 really that we started, that I think started to first hear about this thing called the internet.
Yeah.
But actually, I would go back further, and I think probably broadly a similar age. I think that a lot of the issues, and I would say problems that we face today, stem back really from two politicians, one a president of the United States and one a famous UK Prime Minister. And it's Thatcherism for the UK and Reaganism in the early 1980s,
Yeah.
because that is the era, that is the time. In all step, you can research it back historically to Milton Friedman in the 1970s and the idea of laissez-faire economics, laissez-faire, just letting things go, just let the markets rip. So that is the thinking that and in Britain it was often called monetarism, that immerses itself and ingrains itself in Anglo-American culture in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Mrs. Thatcher comes to power. I was 13 when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in May of 1979, and I remember that being a huge change to British culture. And then, of course, a year or so later, I think it was November 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected. Um, so you're suddenly the era of consensus is shattered, both in Britain and America. There was an era of post-war consensus, But that then gets shattered with the deregulation that happens in the 1980s. And you might say, well, what's that got to do with big tech and social media today? Well, that creates the conditions from which the development of the internet takes place because it's the free market conditions and it's the idea that suddenly, oh, there's a new invention, so everybody must leap onto it to try and exploit it. And if you're old enough like me, you may remember the tech bubble of the late 90s, early 2000s, when there was so much speculation on tech stocks that there was a kind of mini Wall Street crash because the technology wasn't quite there yet, I think, to justify the amount of capital that was being invested. And it's interesting because, the internet is actually the product of a British guy called Tim Berners-Lee, who, or should I say, not the internet, the World Wide Web. It was he who wrote the program at CERN in 1990, the Physics Research Institute, that developed the idea of computer-to-computer communication,
Yeah.
in which the web would arise as an abstract space. So before you had to know a physical connection between computer to computer to be able to use quote unquote the internet. But what the World Wide Web did was create hyperlinks, which allowed people not to know which computer they were connecting to in the world, but just simply to have this abstract space. Now, the reason I mentioned the scientist is because he could have exploited that. He could have, declared himself and patented it and declared himself the inventor. What he did was he decided that this was such an important thing that he would give it to the world for free. And so Tim Berners-Lee is still around today, and he still doesn't regret that decision. But what he does regret is the way in which the internet has unleashed a lot of ills on society, a lot of good things as well, of course. I
Yeah.
mean, like we're speaking today would be absolutely impossible without that technology. But it's the idea of with every new invention, there's a whole heap of problems that we never envisaged. And, I'm old enough to realize that if we went back 30 years ago and people, and we started to talk about cybercrime or cyber stalking or polarization through social media, people would not know what you were talking about.
Yeah.
It would make no sense to them whatsoever. So unfortunately, I would regard the way that the web and technology has gone as being integrally related to the increasing corporatization and deregulation that happened a decade or so earlier in the early 19 and through the 1980s.
So, in your career, when you look back on your career and the work that you've done and everything that you've accomplished in your life, what are you the proudest of?
Probably my family. Well, a lot of people would say that, personally. But in career terms, few things over the years. I'm proud of the work that I managed to do in Dennis Potter, and also actually proud that I was able to, in many ways, I'm very grateful to Dennis Potter for granting me that interview because it did. I remember people saying no one will demur if you get the interview with Dennis Potter, and he didn't have to give it, and he very kindly gave it because I had spoken to so many of his colleagues. There was nothing in it for him. Could have been a lot to lose, actually. So that established me. But what I'm proud of is the fact I was able to give something back years after he died by suggesting to his native community in the Forest of Dean in the west of England that his papers were in a bit of a mess and perhaps we should do something to create a permanent archive and not to sell it to the highest bidder, University of Texas or whatever, but actually to honor him in his native Forest of Dean community. Now, I could not have done anything like that on my own. It was actually the Forest of Dean community who saw the opportunity and rose to the challenge. And one person I'd want to name check actually is a local activist in the Forest of Dean called Jason Griffiths, who helped a great deal to make this happen. But I'm certainly very proud to be associated with that. Um, Also proud of the work I've done on screenwriting education. If people look me up, you'll see that I developed the first master's degrees in the UK around teaching specifically television writing. And again, that feeds off my work on Dennis Potter and screenwriters. So proud of that. And but generally, I tend, I still have that kind of Scottish. There's in Scotland there is a Presbyter, the John Knox Presbyterianism. So we were taught, years and years ago that pride is a sin. So we although I'm not religious, there's still that kind of cultural
Yeah,
aspect. So be proud, but not too proud.
totally. So at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, everyone that you've taught, all of your colleagues, everyone around you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Um, Well, one can be many different people in the space of a day, and that's one of the things that, the surrealists like our friend David Lynch that you mentioned, but also what I would call non-naturalists like Dennis Potter explore, which is you can be many different things and many different persona. Family person at home, serious academic in a university environment, and maybe somebody hopefully a bit more light-hearted in your everyday life. So I don't have a single fixed identity, but I do have a sense of purpose and a sense of integration. And I think one of the key things that we all need, and actually it touches on something you raised at the very beginning of our interview, which is that balance, that we all need to be, ourselves are a series of competing and warring forces. And if you're not careful, you can be perpetually at war with yourself, let alone other people and society in terms of doubts or stresses or anxieties. All these things often are because of there are warring forces within yourself. So one of the key things I think in life is to find a sense of integrated identity where you're at peace with yourself and all these warring forces. And being at peace with yourself then allows you to engage much more proactively and positively with the outside world. And, to go back to our social media discussion earlier, that's probably what's gone wrong in societies. We're also polarized and not at peace with each other. And that's why nothing can get done uh,
Yeah,
socially.
totally. So if anyone wants to reach out, they want to learn more about what you're doing, any of the good work, where's the best place to go?
At the moment, probably my LinkedIn profile. And also there you can click as well and see the various publications and things that I've done. There's been a couple of new things this year, so it's not quite 100% up to date, but certainly it covers the major milestones, the 30 years of or so of my career. You could also check out my GRC Media YouTube page, where I have actually, through the power of AI, restored that Dennis Potter interview. It's this year marked Dennis Potter, what would have been his 90th birthday.
Wow.
So in honor of that, in May, I actually did a sort of very low rent version of what the Beatles did with the John Lennon. Remember the Beatles sort of used AI to
Yeah.
kind of clean up John Lennon's
Yeah.
voice. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there are sort of desktop tools out there that could clean up the interview that I did with Potter, because the interview was recorded for private purposes and it was recorded on an old analog cassette player
Yeah.
with lots of background noise and hiss. And lo and behold, I did some experiments just on my laptop, and I managed to clean up the sound to such an extent that it's almost as if he's in the back in the room
Wow.
with you.
That's
So
great.
so just very, very basic desktop tools, AI tools can do that. So what I've done is I've taken a couple of choice extracts from that interview, and with the help of my son, I should say, who provided the visuals, we've released a couple of videos, so people can hear that. And Potter was a great interviewee, and some of his words are like poetry. So I would certainly direct people to the GRC media page. And lastly, with my partner Charlotte, we've also launched the Final Cut podcast, and we're doing work in the podcasting field, which again people can find. And we've interviewed some really interesting folks. Interestingly, most of the audience is coming from the States. So we've tended to therefore interview people from the States, but interestingly, people who've been involved in Hollywood, such as a makeup artist called Bonnie Clivering sticks in the mind because she had a long career and she's worked from everybody from Elvis and Frank Sinatra right through to being best mates with Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts. So that was an entertaining podcast which is available, and we've also interviewed a Hollywood stuntman as well, and we've got more coming up. So have a look at or listen to the Final Cut podcast.
Sounds wonderful. I will put all these links in the show notes. Professor Cook, what a great time. Thank you, sir. So great to meet you. Thank you for your stories. Thank you for your time, and best of luck with everything.
Thanks very much, Joe. A pleasure.
Thank you.